Chapters 23 and 24 of Napoleon and Marie-Louise, The Fall of the Empire, by Walter Geer. This recording is in the public domain. 23. 1810. Drifting toward war. Upon the return to St. Cloud the 1st of June, fêtes were announced, which would take up the entire month. Although hardly recovered from an accident unsuspected by the public, Marie-Louise was forced to make her Parisian debut. Upon that redoubtable theatre where every mistake is noted with an ill will of habitual comparison, where to succeed, it is necessary to win every one by displaying gifts of grace and charm which alone establish and admitted sovereignty. It was indeed a hard task for a young and inexperienced girl to appear before such an audience in the role of the incomparable Joséphine. For the first time since his marriage, the Emperor seemed disposed to give some attention to public affairs. He called meetings of the Council for every day of the week. Only on Thursdays, after a small dinner, was there to be a theatrical performance; on Sundays, after the Mass, a large reception, and the usual family dinner, followed by a concert in the state apartments. The other evenings there were only private receptions, limited to not more than 50 persons, men and women. On Thursday, the 7th of June, it was necessary to go to Paris to receive the compliments of the ambassadors at a solemn audience of the diplomatic corps. At 1 o'clock there was a grand review in the Carrousel of the cavalry and infantry of the Guard. Following this, the Emperor and Empress, with a numerous suite, went to visit the Jardin des Plantes, which was closed for that day to the public. Then, by the boulevards and the Place de la Concorde, the procession returned to St. Cloud. On Sunday the Princess de Schwarzenberg was received in great state at a private audience. She came in person to extend an invitation to their Majesties to be present at a large ball to be given by the ambassador on the 1st of July. After this reception and a hurried dinner, it was necessary to leave at 8 o'clock for the fête given by the city at the Hôtel de Ville. The cortège followed the same route as on the day of the marriage. The whole length of the Champs-Élysées was brilliantly lighted, as also the palace of the Tuileries and the Louvre. All the details of the decorations had been under the charge of Prudhon, and were a great success. Following the formal reception by the municipality there was a ball, which was opened by the Empress, who had as her partner the King of Westphalia. After the quadrille, Marie-Louise returned to her throne, while the Emperor made the tour of the hall, asking his usual questions, in the endeavor to render himself popular. At midnight the sovereigns left the ball to return to St. Cloud. This fête had cost the good city of Paris over 3,000,000 francs, but the Emperor was not content. Marie-Louise, for whom it was given, had offended everybody by her silence, her lack of cordiality and charm. At a distance, however, she produced a better impression. When she appeared at the Opéra 2 days later, she was loudly applauded, and Napoleon was pleased with the grace she displayed in bowing her acknowledgments. On the 14th of June a magnificent entertainment was given by the Princess Pauline at Neuilly, where from 8 o'clock in the evening until midnight, without a moment of repose, one surprise was followed by another. This was an ideal celebration, which surpassed in magnificence all which had preceded it, and was talked of for years to come. In the midst of all these marvels Marie-Louise preserved her usual impassibility. A real statue, as cold and lifeless as marble. "Ta fête m'a enchantée," said the Emperor to Pauline, but from Marie-Louise not a compliment, not a word of thanks. A week later, at the fête given by the Minister of War, she displayed the same lack of animation. But on this occasion, with Eugène as a partner, she danced; which seemed to please her, but which she did very badly. On the 24th of June a grand festival was given by the Imperial Guard in the Champ de Mars, where, in the presence of 300,000 spectators, there were horse and chariot races, balloon ascensions, and at the end a magnificent display of fireworks. The Emperor came in state, with unusual ceremonies, saluted by 60 salvos of artillery. After dining with the kings and queens he viewed from a balcony the popular games, and then returned to the ballroom, where a series of ballets was given by the dancers of the Opéra. This was the end of the fêtes, except that to be given on the 1st day of July by the Austrian ambassador. "The Empress," wrote a friendly observer, "has begun to lose her German traits. She now turns out her feet and bows with her head and not her knees." The hotel of the Austrian ambassador, Prince de Schwarzenberg, was in the Chaussee d'Antin, and the gardens in the rear extended along the Rue de Provence as far as the Rue Thibault. It was the former residence of Madame de Montesson, the morganatic wife of the Duc d'Orléans, the father of Égalité. Louis XVI had refused to acknowledge the marriage, so the Duc gave up his residence in the Palais Royal, and established himself in an adjoining house, Rue de Provence. The separating walls were torn down and the gardens were united, but the two private entrances were maintained. Preparations for the fête had been made on a scale of extraordinary magnificence. As the rez-de-chaussée of the hotel was not spacious enough, in the gardens there had been constructed in wood a large ballroom which was reached from the house by a wooden gallery. The walls and ceiling were covered with oilcloth decorated with painted ornaments. It would be hard to imagine a worse fire trap. Late in the evening, as the Emperor was about to leave, one of the gauze curtains was blown by a current of air against the side light in the gallery. The fire communicated to the ballroom, which was at once in flames, and the only avenue of escape was by way of the gardens. Eugène, who was one of the first to perceive the danger, notified the Emperor. Napoleon, with his decision of the field of battle, traversed the ballroom with a quick but measured step, offered his arm to the Empress, and with her disappeared by the nearest exit. In the panic which ensued, Princess Pauline Schwarzenberg, sister-in-law of the ambassador, lost her life, and several others were so severely burned that they died a few days later. Napoleon accompanied the Empress as far as the Place de la Concorde, then while she returned to St. Cloud, he went back to the hotel, where in pouring rain he directed the work until 3 o'clock in the morning. At Paris this event produced a very sad impression. Many persons recalled the catastrophe in the Place Louis XV 40 years before, on the occasion of the fête of Marie Antoinette, and saw in it a presage of ill omen. But this sombre presentiment was soon forgotten, only to be recalled later when the news was received of the burning of Moscow. Among the number of those severely injured at the fire was Prince Korakin, the Russian ambassador. Old and infirm and hastening to escape, he fell, was trampled by the crowd, and his head and hands were badly burned. He was confined to his bed for several weeks, and disappeared from the scene just at the moment when his services were most needed in conducting the difficult and delicate negotiations over the Polish treaty. In place of the note to Korakin, drafted some time before, but never sent, on the 4th July, the Emperor dictated to Champagny a few lines, in which he demanded whether the ambassador was empowered to sign a convention which, while guarding all the interests of Russia, would conserve the dignity of France. The following evening Metternich appeared at St. Cloud and asked for a private audience with the Emperor. He brought the grave news, just received from Vienna, that the Russian army had passed the Danube and was invading the central provinces of Turkey. At his first words Napoleon went in search of a large map of the Balkans, which he brought unrolled in his hands. The interest with which he was observing the operations of the war was disclosed by the pins which indicated the positions of the different army corps. Following the information given by the ambassador, he moved these pins to show the Russian advance, and carefully studied the map for a quarter of an hour without saying a word. Then he announced his diagnosis. "Voilà la paix. Yes, it means peace. The Turks are forced to make it. Well, it is, as I said to you recently, the alliance between France and Austria. Our interests are common." These words, so different from the expressions used by him only 3 weeks before, show how far the Emperor had gone in so short a time in his detachment from Russia. 2 weeks later, under peremptory orders from his government, Metternich again sought an interview. This time his demand was stated in these terms: "Is the Emperor decided to maintain in all particulars the engagements which he contracted at Erfurt, or will he lend himself to make in common accord with us a démarche at Petersburg which can save the principalities?" The reply of Napoleon was most positive. "I have contracted engagements," he said, "which I have neither reason nor pretext to violate. To act now contrary to these engagements would furnish Russia at once with a direct motive for war, which does not accord with my views. or would deprive me absolutely for all time of the right to be believed in any of my engagements. What guarantee should I be able to furnish one day to you yourself, in case I break an explicit engagement, for the simple reason that, circumstances having changed, I have less need to consider the power with which I had contracted it?" However, Napoleon did not wish to allow Metternich to leave without a word of hope, and he added in conclusion, "If the case arises that the Russians wish to be foolish enough to break with us, which will cost them Finland, Moldavia, and Wallachia, acquired under the shield of their alliance with me, you know that you can count on me. You will then communicate your ideas to me, as I will communicate mine to you." At Erfurt, in 1808, Alexander had promised to be satisfied with Moldavia and Wallachia. Napoleon believed that he would keep his engagements both in letter and in spirit, and not cross the Danube. But he said to Metternich, "L'appétit vient en mangeant," and he was not sure what plans Russia might have at present. The apprehensions of Austria, however, were unfounded, for Alexander desired nothing more than the principalities. He was now obsessed with the idea that Napoleon was preparing to attack him, and he was anxious to finish with the Turks in order to have all his forces free to meet this new peril. In the meantime, the Peninsular War was still causing Napoleon much embarrassment. Notwithstanding the presence of Massena, the ablest of his marshals, and a vast deployment of forces, no satisfactory results were achieved. The operations dragged on. The sieges were costly. The Spanish resistance was universal, and the French troops were becoming more and more discouraged. In the south, Soult had conquered Andalusia, but failed to take Cadiz. Massena, with 3 army corps, had not succeeded in subduing Portugal. Augereau in Catalonia, and Suchet in Valencia, only advanced step by step, obliged to storm every city they reached, quarter by quarter. The situation was naturally exaggerated by the English papers, which represented every check as a reverse, and every reverse as a disaster. These false reports spread to every capital on the Continent, and made a profound impression at St. Petersburg. The time, to many observers, seemed propitious to fall upon France, or at least to throw off the burden of the continental system which was paralyzing Russian commerce. Napoleon realized this danger, and endeavored to avert it. He ordered Champagny to write Caulaincourt, "Do not let them think that the Emperor is not prepared to make war again upon the Continent. If he has 300,000 men in Spain, he has 400,000 in France and elsewhere. The army of Italy also is still intact. The moment that war broke out, the Emperor could present himself upon the Niemen with an army more considerable than the one he had at Friedland. His intimate union with Austria permits him to count upon the support of that power, already much alarmed over the progress of the Russian arms in Turkey. The Emperor undoubtedly does not want to make war. He values and regards his alliance with Russia as the base of his politics, but he will make war at once if Russia draws near to England." Did this mean that Napoleon wished for war with Russia, and looked forward to it with sang-froid? Not at all. At least not in the immediate future. If inevitable, he desired to postpone it, as he had endeavored to put off the war with Austria in 1809. Whatever he might say in his dispatches, a new conflict at the present time would seriously embarrass him. The Spanish war was devouring his forces, depleting his treasury, and was leaving at his disposition few men and feeble resources. When he spoke of an army of 400,000 men, he was discounting the future. He could have them in 1811 or the year following, but he did not have them then. In the meantime he endeavors to inspire fear, de payer d'audace. Better than any one else he realized the dangers of a war in the barren steppes of the north. Had he not said a short time before, in speaking of Poland, "Je ne veux pas aller finir mes destinées dans les sables de ces déserts"? But he was more determined than ever to bring to a conclusion his vendetta against England, and if Russia renewed her commercial relations with that power, war was inevitable. This supreme conflict with the great empire of the North seems to him more and more probable, and it is the fatal year of 1812 which he indicates for the date of the rupture. He therefore begins to make certain strategic precautions. If he does not send any more troops across the Rhine, if he leaves his army in Germany reduced to the 3 divisions of Davout, he demands with great secrecy of the King of Saxony to let him know the state of his forces, the condition of the fortresses, and the quantity of arms in the Grand Duchy. In the times in which we live," he writes, "circumstances command prudence." He also designates the places to be fortified, and proposes to send the King 30,000 muskets to be stored at Warsaw. While Napoleon was beginning to contemplate the possibility of war, Alexander was looking forward to it as a certainty, and was already making his preparations. But with his usual duplicity he concealed his intentions. To Caulaincourt his words were as friendly and cordial as ever. In August, 1810, he said, "I desire peace, I wish for the alliance." At the same time he was considering the strategic precautions to take in case of a rupture, and permitted a Prussian officer to submit to him a plan of campaign against France. Within the Russian frontiers he was constructing a vast line of fortifications to protect the central parts of the Empire, to cover the 2 capitals, and bar the routes of invasion. Everything was being done with feverish haste, as if the war were only a question of days. In the territory between the Dvina and Dnieper, the vulnerable point of the Empire, redoubts and entrenched camps were rapidly constructed, the men working night and day by superior orders. But Alexander did not confine himself to the preparation of lines of defense. In the second half of 1810, before Napoleon had moved a man, the Russian troops behind the frontier were heavily reinforced, and became a real field army. No reports of these movements were allowed to get out. In that vast and mute empire, where silence was a tradition and a law, the French ambassadors, surrounded by polite attentions, deprived of any serious sources of information, saw only the palace and the court, where there were no indications of anything unusual. By the end of the year Alexander expected to have mobilized on the western frontier 300,000 men, who, in case of need, could be reinforced by several corps recalled from the Danube. Knowing that Napoleon had only 50,000 men in Germany, the Czar was at first inclined to assume the offensive, and seize Poland by a coup de main, but he finally abandoned this project, as will appear later. From all these preparations must we conclude that Alexander wished for war? No more than Napoleon. Unfortunately he had conceived the idea that Napoleon was only awaiting the propitious moment to attack Russia, and complete the subjugation of the continent. That the Czar's fears were unfounded, it is difficult to assert. Napoleon by his arbitrary methods had given only 2 just grounds for apprehension. From the Pyrenees to the Niemen his rule was absolute. Thinking everything permitted him to complete his work because nothing any longer seems to him impossible, he multiplies his acts of violence, accumulates his mistakes, and believing that he is approaching his object, rushes with rapid steps in the path of perdition. The despotic measures adopted to exclude British commerce from the continent, and break the last powers of resistance of that nation, if they were not immediately successful, would certainly result in precipitating a rupture with Russia. 24. 1810. The election of Bernadotte. After the conquest of Prussia in 1806, Napoleon had issued his famous Berlin Decree, proclaiming a continental blockade against English commerce. Master of all the ports from Naples to Danzig, he forbade access of vessels under the British flag to this enormous extent of sea-coast, and prohibited the direct importation of commodities. This idea of strangling English commerce was not original with him. It was a pet scheme of the Jacobins, and an inheritance of the Revolution. The reply of Great Britain was her Orders in Council of 1807, compelling all neutral vessels, under pain of seizure, to recognize her maritime supremacy. The effect of these acts was to make all neutral ships factors of British commerce. The importations of goods did not cease, but the means of transport was changed. Napoleon's riposte was the Milan Decree of November 1807, declaring that such neutral vessels were in effect English, that is to say enemies, and therefore liable to seizure in any port. Up to the present time, this decree, in most of the northern countries, had been only a menace. He now proposed to enforce it strictly. This action, in effect, would deprive all Europe of commercial relations with the rest of the world. and it was beyond the power even of Napoleon to enforce such an edict. It led to the seizure of provinces, the annexation of kingdoms, and finally to the disastrous war with Russia. The first decisive result of this policy was a break with his brother Louis. The king agreed to take energetic measures against England, but failed to keep his promise. The 1st of July, 1810, he abdicated his throne, and on the 9th Holland was formally united to the Empire. In the course of the following 7 months, by successive steps, Napoleon extended his control to all the territory between the Rhine and the Baltic, as far as the borders of Russia. When he thought that he had closed all the ports on the North Sea and the Baltic, he suddenly realized that there still remained one point where English goods could enter. Between Mecklenburg and Prussia there was a little stretch of seacoast, a fraction of Pomerania. It was all that remained in Germany of the vast possessions formerly controlled by Gustavus Adolphus. In spite of the engagements of Sweden, Pomerania and the port of Stralsund remained open to English commerce. Moreover, the ports of Sweden continued to hold relations with the enemy, and were used largely by the smugglers who were awaiting an opportunity to land their goods on the opposite shores of the Baltic. In May, 1810, Napoleon sent Sweden a menacing letter, calling attention to this infringement of the treaty, and threatening a rupture in case of failure to comply with his demands. By tradition and by instinct, Sweden was inclined toward France. Through the folly of the late king, the country had plunged into a disastrous war with Russia, which had resulted in the loss of Finland. In order to resist the Czar, the protection of Napoleon seemed indispensable. On the other hand, a rupture with England would reduce the nation to the direst want. In exchange for the products of her rich mines and forests, England supplied Sweden with many articles necessary for her existence. Salt, for example, which Sweden did not possess, and could not manufacture herself. To these material difficulties were added the perils of the political situation. As the result of a military conspiracy, Gustavus IV had been exiled in 1809, and his uncle Charles XIII called to the throne. The latter was old and infirm, and had no child to succeed him. In June, 1809, the States chose as heir to the crown Prince d'Augustenburg, brother-in-law of the King of Denmark. This prince had little to recommend him, but he was hailed as a pledge of national independence. Unfortunately, on the 28th of May, 1810, during a review, he was suddenly stricken with an attack of dizziness, fell from his horse, and was picked up dead. This catastrophe occurred at the very moment that Napoleon was pressing his demands, and caused general consternation. As the situation would admit of no delay, it was necessary to reconvene the States and elect a successor. The person naturally indicated seemed to be a younger brother of the late prince, but the king and his advisers felt so strongly the need of propitiating Napoleon, that it was thought best to seek his advice before making any choice. Accordingly, on the 2nd of June, Charles wrote a most submissive letter to Napoleon, in which he clearly indicated his preference for the second prince of the Augustenburg family, and demanded the approval of the Emperor. Napoleon seems to have taken but little interest in this election, which was to have such a decisive effect upon his destiny. He only wanted a man strong enough to compel the nation to break with England, and one not too subservient to Russia, while being at the same time persona grata to the Czar. For these reasons he excluded the Duke of Oldenburg, the brother-in-law of Alexander, as likely to be too friendly, and the King of Denmark, as calculated to increase the suspicions of the Czar. In his reply, under the date of the 24th June, Napoleon accepted with good grace the name of Prince d'Augustenburg. Since the peace with Sweden, France had been represented at Stockholm only by a chargé d'affaires, but the Emperor had recently named Baron Alquier as his minister, and he now ordered the Baron to set out at once for his post. At the same time he wrote Champagny, "You will instruct him to support warmly, but without compromising me, the Prince of Denmark." By this term he designated Prince d'Augustenburg, who was a member of the younger branch of the Danish royal family. Napoleon would have been much surprised if he had known that at this moment an intrigue was being woven at Paris to place on the throne of Sweden one of his marshals, Bernadotte, Prince de Pontecorvo. Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, whose career was almost as romantic as that of Napoleon himself, was born in Pau in 1763, the son of a procurator. Having entered the army at the age of 16, he took 10 years to become a sergeant, the highest rank that he would ever have attained except for the outbreak of the Revolution. That event gave him his opportunity, and 5 years later we find him a general of division even before Napoleon had reached that rank. In 1797 he served under Bonaparte in Italy, where he made a good record. But he refused to take part in the expedition to Egypt. In 1798 he was sent as ambassador to Vienna, but was compelled to leave his post owing to a disturbance caused by his hoisting the tricolor over the embassy. Returning to Paris, he married Désirée Clary, sister of the wife of Joseph Bonaparte, who at one time was considered as a match for Napoleon. This same year, from July to September, he was War Minister, in which capacity he displayed much ability. He held aloof from Bonaparte at the time of the coup d'état, but accepted a command under the Consulate, and on the founding of the Empire was made a Marshal. He was rewarded for his services at Austerlitz by the Principality of Pontecorvo. During the campaign of Jena, however, he was very derelict in his duties, and would probably have been court-martialed except for his connection with Joseph. In the last war with Austria he had again incurred the ill will of the Emperor, by a proclamation in which he falsely attributed the victory of Wagram to the Saxon troops under his command. In 1807, during the war between Russia and Sweden, Bernadotte had commanded in Pomerania a French corps which was intended to invade Sweden. At this time he had showed some favors to 2 brothers by the name of Morner, and had later sent them back to Sweden. In June 1810, one of these officers, who had become a colonel, called on Bernadotte at his hotel in the Rue d'Anjou at Paris, and suggested that he should allow his name to be proposed as a successor to their deceased Crown Prince. At first Bernadotte was not inclined to take the matter seriously, but a few days later the offer was confirmed by Comte Wrede, a man of great prominence, who had been sent as envoy extraordinary on the occasion of Napoleon's marriage. The next day Bernadotte went to St. Cloud and laid the matter before the Emperor, who said to him, "I know all about it, and leave you free to accept or refuse. I would rather see you there than any one else. I will support you with my consent. Take what steps are necessary." It is impossible to understand this désinvolture on the part of Napoleon in the case of a man whom he had always disliked and distrusted, whom he had given a command in several of his campaigns only because he feared to leave him behind in France. By a unique exception in his career, as if the events which drew him on were so far beyond human calculations that even his genius could not dominate them, he yields to them, abstains from action, and almost from volition. He had no one but himself to blame in the grave events which were to follow. The only serious effort made by Napoleon to prevent the election of Bernadotte was to offer the crown to Eugène. He sent Duroc to the Viceroy, who was then in Paris, to ascertain his views on the subject. After taking a day for reflection, and talking the proposition over with his wife, Eugène informed the Emperor that they would prefer to stay in Italy. In reaching this decision, they were influenced by the reluctance of Augusta to give up the Catholic faith, which would have been required. It is rather a curious coincidence that their daughter Joséphine afterwards married Bernadotte's son Oscar, and their grandson became King of Sweden. In the meantime Bernadotte had left Paris for his country estate, where he lived quietly, while keeping in close touch, through his agents, with affairs in Sweden. At Stockholm the candidature of the Marshal at first was not taken seriously by the King and his ministers. But the representatives of Bernadotte, liberally supplied with money, began to make an impression on the populace and the army. On the 20th June, when the body of the late Crown Prince was brought back to the capital, there was a popular outbreak, during which the Comte de Fersen, the former lover of Marie Antoinette, lost his life. Terrified by this event, the government turned even more anxiously to Napoleon. "Let the Emperor give us one of his kings, and Sweden will be saved," said M. Surmain, aide de camp of the King, to the French chargé d'affaires, M. Desaugiers. Taking the Emperor too literally at his word, Champagny had broken off all correspondence with Sweden, and left the French representative entirely in the dark. At this moment there fell under the eyes of Desaugiers an apparently inspired article in the Journal de l'Empire of the 17th of June. in which the attention of the Swedes was called to the King of Denmark as a desirable choice. Encouraged by the language of the official journal, and implored by all the Swedes around him to say a word, he announced himself in favor of the King of Denmark, and the union of the two crowns as the best means of defense against the Muscovite peril. When the Emperor read on the 25th July the dispatch in which Desaugiers innocently rendered a report of his imprudent declarations, there was an outburst of wrath, and Champagny was ordered to recall the unfortunate chargé d'affaires. Napoleon still wished to keep on good terms with Alexander, at least in appearances, and it was principally with this object in view that he had abstained from supporting Bernadotte. To repair this error as quickly as possible, the Emperor again, and this time definitely, ordered Alquier to start for his post. Even if he left Paris the same day, however, it was impossible for the minister to reach Sweden before the end of August, that is to say after the election, which was to be held during the first half of the month. In fact, the Electoral Diet met in the city of Örebro on the 25th of July. The government, perplexed between the contradictory statements of the French chargé d'affaires and the letter of the 24th of June from the Emperor, hardly knew what course to pursue, but finally decided to support the Augustenburg prince. To this end it employed an involved diplomacy directed mainly against Bernadotte, who was receiving strong support. His principal adherents were found among the lower classes, while the court and the aristocracy opposed him on account of his revolutionary antecedents. Everything seemed to point to the election of Augustenburg, when a report spread through the Assembly that Napoleon had spoken, and that he desired the choice of Bernadotte. This rumor was entirely false, and was the work of an impostor. A Frenchman by the name of Fournier, formerly vice-consul at Gothenburg, where he had left a very bad reputation, had seen in the candidacy of Bernadotte an opportunity to rehabilitate himself. Owing to his former position, he had the entrée of the Office of Foreign Affairs, and succeeded in persuading Champagny that it would be to the interests of France to have an unofficial observer present at the meeting of the Swedish Diet, to keep Paris informed regarding the proceedings. By way of credentials the minister furnished Fournier with a paper known as a "diplomatic passport," drawn up in his own hand. Armed with this document, and instructions from Bernadotte, the agent left Paris immediately, and reached Örebro a few days before the meeting of the Diet. Upon reflection, Champagny realized the error that he had made in furnishing the discredited vice-consul with such credentials, and wrote the French legation at Stockholm to disavow him, but it was too late. As soon as he arrived on the scene, Fournier posed as the unofficial emissary of the French government, which was prevented by high interests from appearing openly. He stated that the Emperor was in favor of the election of Bernadotte, and made free use of his passport to gain the confidence of the Swedes. At the same time he organized a very strong campaign in favor of his candidate. But the argument which prevailed over all opposition was the feeling that Napoleon at last had spoken and indicated his choice. The only serious opposition came from the aged king, who could not reconcile himself to the thought of having a "French corporal" as the heir to his throne. On the advice of his ministers, however, Charles finally gave way, and the 21st of August Bernadotte was chosen by the Diet, the members acting under the belief that they were carrying out the wishes of the Emperor. A word from him, pronounced in the beginning, would have prevented all these misunderstandings and this deplorable outcome. On receipt of the news from Sweden, Napoleon was both surprised and displeased. For a moment he thought of refusing his consent, and keeping Bernadotte in France. He made the mistake of not following his first impulse, and allowed Bernadotte to depart, after having loaded him with presents and obtained his promise to enforce the continental system. His course is explained by a remark to Metternich: "In any event I could not refuse my consent, for a French marshal on the throne of Gustavus Adolphus is one of the prettiest tricks ever played on England." On Sunday, the 23rd of September, there was a grand review, lasting 4 hours, in the court of the Tuileries, which Marie-Louise watched from a window of the château. Afterwards there was the usual family dinner, to which a stranger was invited for the first and only time — the Prince de Pontecorvo with his wife. He came as a Marshal of the Empire, but in a Swedish uniform, and was presented to the Empress in his quality as Crown Prince of Sweden. The following morning before the hunt, Bernadotte appeared at St. Cloud, again in Swedish costume, and took his final leave of the Emperor. Chapters 23 and 24